much. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really humbled and honoured to be here today, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I'm not a philosopher, and well, I have a PhD in philosophy, but my supervisor at the time told me that I wasn't a philosopher and kicked me out of the philosophy program. So I ended up moving to political science. So I know really very well that I'm not a philosopher. But having said that, I think what I'm going to be talking about today is super relevant to a lot of your research. I think we must have a lot of overlapping interests. And yeah, I'd really just like to share with you the past 18 months of work that I've been doing, which has consisted of a lot of really fascinating field work that yeah, I think is going to be really interesting. So there are two sides of oh, here we go. Beautiful. There are two sides of artificial intelligence. You probably experienced in, what was it, October last year, when ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney came out, and suddenly we were making a bunch of pictures of ourselves. And when I was making my AI pictures, I have two mini Dachshunds that are very close to me in my life, my little boy and my little girl. And I have so many pictures of me with them that when I put the images into an AI, it just, all of them came out with Dachshunds everywhere, because that's just, it's the data set influenced the output. So we all had this experience, AI increasingly everywhere in our lives, but of course, AI has this darker side, right? Suddenly, we might have all started also seeing the news reports coming out of the content moderators, the data annotators, these hidden workforces that were in a lot of second language English countries around the world. A lot of this work is getting outsourced. And when we think about an AI system, I think we're encouraged to think of, you know, click of the fingers, click of a switch, everything happens automatically. But of course, that's, you know, far from the truth. And that actually, as we move into this increasingly automated world, the systems upon which we rely on this kind of hidden workforce of workers that are doing very menial, very repetitive, very low-paid tasks. And so what I really want to explore today is what is involved in the production of an AI system that we as an end user kind of are concealed from, that we're hidden from. And so you might also have in the back of your mind this idea of AI invented by the Googles and the Metas of the world, that there are kind of very highly paid machine learning engineers, data scientists working on these projects. In terms of the division of actual human hours or labor hours that go into this, what do you think the division would be between like machine learning time versus data annotation time as like a rough percentage? And I'll ask you because you're in the front row. What? Just give me a ballpark.
2080.
And which is which?
Machine learning 20, data 80.
That is exactly right. So, would have been better rhetorically if you said 80-20, but you already know too much. So that's exactly right. It's 80-20. Most of the labor of creating AI systems is actually really low paid data annotation, bounding boxes, line segmentation, that kind of work. And so what I'd like to then kind of open up here is the black box that is these AI systems, right? And so part of, I guess, the argument here is not so much like, here is my normative claim about how this works, or here is what we ought to be doing, but rather trying to open up a different perspective onto this. So a little more continental Deleuze Foucault stuff than your, other kinds of philosophy that you might have. So here's a kind of like a kind of drawn out version of an AI system that might encourage us to think both about its material and kind of infrastructural elements, that it's cables and wires and data centers and heat and electricity and water, but also that it requires all this human labor in different types that are segmented in different ways and divided internationally to different types of people, right? And this is where the kind of colonial lens comes in a little bit. So both the infrastructural element of it, the fact that it has all this labor coming in, and the fact that it's also a bit of a recursive process, right? This is an interconnected value chain that is constantly looping back on itself, right? So once the machine learning algorithms get deployed, they need to be verified. There are problems. The data has to constantly go back to the annotators to get new bits of data done or to fix problems that are happening with the outputs. And so we see the images, the text, the videos, and it's interesting when we kind of try to unpack that a little bit and see something more broadly. So I said before that I'm not going to have like a, this is what you should believe type argument that I'll defend. I think really what I'm trying to go for is hopefully collaborating with you to think about how far we can push some of these concepts or analogies or perspectives. And I want to focus on three particular things, because what I'm doing here is trying to unpack the black box of AI and to show the forms of raw materials, rare earth minerals, human labor, but also human intelligence and knowledge claims and ways of seeing the world that get packaged into these systems. And so there are three kind of concepts, if you will, that I want to develop. And we'll see how we go. So the first of these is that AI is produced through a colonial supply chain. And I wonder how strongly I can push this. I want to at least say that the kind of connections and exchanges that are happening throughout the AI value chain follow or are strongly informed by older colonial trade routes, trading patterns, and power relationships between empires and their former colonies. And I think you'll see when I present you some of the empirical data, just how stark that is. The second is that AI is also structured by what I call an international division of digital labor, that just as some of the coloniality theorists would tell us that different tasks are kind of divided to different types of human populations. And this is a highly racialized form of division of these tasks. And so this is what concerns most of my fieldwork, I would say. And then the third one, and perhaps this is the one that is most interesting to philosophers, is the more epistemic dimension, because really what I'm trying to do is combine some of the political economy concerns with epistemic ones, which is to say that the way in which AI, and here I'm speaking specifically about kind of text AI, generative AI, I think these knowledge claims that you see software like ChatGPT creating, it has a very complicated process of drawing on often unattributed data sources, right? And using these and using the kind of biases and limited perspectives that are inherent in some of these data sets to put forward purportedly universal and objective claims of truth. And I think there's a huge problem there that a lot of, AI bias and AI harms people talk about. So there are kind of three parts of this related to the kind of what goes in, how is it produced, and then what comes out. And again, yeah, I'm trying to approach this with a bit of humility. I don't have super strict, like, this is my normative position, but I have a lot of vibes. That's what I have for one. And really what's structuring this, or what's informing this research project, is an overarching kind of conversation with an interrogation of one particular type of post-colonial writing. And this is the Latin American modernity coloniality school. And so really, I guess one of the big distinguishing characteristics here is their tendency to push the advent of modernity back to the kind of invasion of the Americas, right? That they want to see a hidden darker side of modernity that runs parallel with and is inherently connected to ideas of reason, progress, and development. And that kind of comes hand in hand with this idea of what they call the kind of imposition of a colonial matrix of power. This idea that there are kind of and this is kind of like, think Kimberly Crenshaw, but Latin American coloniality school, because really what they're talking about is multiple and intersecting regimes of oppression that were primarily imported by Europeans into, and for these people, for these theorists, what they're primarily concerned with is kind of the Latin America and to a slightly lesser extent, Asia and Africa. But these kinds of ideas or new ideas that they would see of race, of gender, of religion, and the kind of rough framework of how this works, I'm sure is kind of quite familiar to people, that there is a kind of imposition of the new, the modern, the European, that kind of subordinates and erases a lot of what came before it. And so why would this be particularly interesting for thinking about AI? And I think there are a couple of really good reasons here. So one is there's a really strong tendency here to see colonialism not as something strictly past and already over, but rather something that informs the present. And as I was kind of doing the field work, you know, this, you could really feel and see this in how the kind of AI was produced. And so to define colonialism not as the thing of the past, but coloniality as a structure that still informed the present, and that one of the theorists defines as the long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonization, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. And so this was really started to become apparent when we were in Kenya and Uganda, talking to some of the workers there and trying to understand this series of relationships that pertain to how this AI was being produced in this kind of global production network. Another defining feature of the modernity coloniality school is their tendency not to stick too much to epistemic concerns, but to always ground it in a political economic analysis, right? That it's about how value is produced within complex supply chains, and in particular, thinking about what kinds of labor is going into this process and how that labor is structured, that is very important. And so finally, I think these theorists offer us an important and kind of vital lens to think about modern technology, in particular AI, because they were so onto how important communication and transportation technology were for the conquest of a lot of the colonial territories, and that this idea that the Europeans had this superior knowledge, superior technology, was instrumentalized in a kind of theory of racial hierarchy, and this played such a fundamental role and was constitutive with the kinds of violence that were imposed on people and the conquest of territories and the erasure of people and their lands and livelihoods. So modernity coloniality school, kind of the theory through which we engage with and kind of the lens through which we view a lot of these. And so how does this help us think more about AI? So one of these is thinking about the increasing centralization of both the intellectual property rights to a lot of this technology, but also the ownership over the infrastructure and hardware. So one of the key transitions that I think is currently happening is from a kind of software layer where ownership over a digital platform like a social media network or, I don't know, an online retail store is what gives you a lot of the power. And I think increasingly with AI, we're going to see a shift from the software layer to the hardware layer, right? That you need access to computational power to run the kind of foundation models of AI systems. And that fundamentally changes who are the most powerful players within this system, right? So NVIDIA was recently valued as a kind of $1 trillion company, the company that produces some of these really advanced GPU chips that are essential for AI to operate. You see companies like Google and Amazon investing literally tens of billions of dollars in data centers and new infrastructure. You know, when a lot of these platform companies, as we used to call them, were kind of receiving prominence in the kind of 2015, 26 big tech criticism era, you know, people saw these as like lean platforms, or they don't own anything. They're just allowing you all to interact online. That's just not the case. That's not how the tech world works, at least not anymore. And so the coloniality framework helps us to think about this concentration of resources and infrastructure and the ways in which technology is then exported out, right? So you have a very similar kind of central and peripheral relationship between these countries in which, you know, the kind of infrastructural layer is owned and concentrated in the West and increasingly a little bit in China. And that data is gathered from these locations and kind of end user technology is sent out so that they can use them. But of course, that establishes this very asymmetrical relationship of power between those who own and those who rent or use. So I think it really gives us a very important insight that would otherwise be lacking, because it's not, you know, the fact that the AI centers are located where they are has a very clear historical origin. So the first part of this is thinking about the colonial supply chain. And one of the first kind of, you know, moves that we need to make is remembering that AI has a material layer, right? It's not just an application, it's more than software. So this was like the first image that came up when I Googled AI. And it reminded me of a Kate Crawford quote where, you know, she talks about, you know, the image that everyone has is like either a white robot or like a blue neural network of some description, right? And she says that there's this powerful resistance to engaging with the materialities of these technologies. The fact that, look, these are very hot humming data centers, they're undersea submarine cables that have had to be laid. The submarine cables themselves obviously follow and are alongside the telegraph cables that connected the colonies to the metropoles of the empires to begin with. So thinking about some of this helps like just make that more concrete, right? The amount of money and capital that's being invested by these tech companies into this. Now, thinking about this in more detail, we start to then turn to, well, what is needed for this? So you need obviously a lot of the rare earth minerals to construct things like laptops, mobile phones, all the tech we use to access the application layer of AI. Obviously, all of these critical minerals are in places like China, to a lesser extent, Australia, Chile, and elsewhere. But not only this, so even once these kind of technology is produced, AI itself requires a lot of electricity and water to run, basically. And the reason I don't have that many figures up here is because they're really hard to come by. And I think in the next 5 or so years, I think this will be really a frontier area of research, thinking about the environmental impact of AI, right? Because we have a few studies, but they're hotly contested. Because essentially, well, one of the reasons is that the compute power and the resources of these places, obviously a closely guarded secret of these tech companies, right? But even when we have some figures, for instance, they will publish environmental reports. Sometimes they are forced to divulge certain figures when they have interactions with public authorities. And researchers can also estimate based on their kind of, you know, research into how much it would cost them to do something similar. One of the most famous studies was Struble and colleagues. It's the one that's most quoted when we're thinking about the carbon footprint of training a model. And this has come up with something like 5 cars worth of carbon emissions over the course of their lifetime to train ChatGPT or something similar, something NLP like that. And that might be a lot for you, or it might be not very much. But it's something that I think we're going to need to pay more and more attention to, because as AI becomes more integrated into really everyday applications, it's going to be something that is going to be on everyone's minds. This also kind of draws us to the idea that AI is now also caught up in this new Cold War between China and the US, with trade embargoes, and the attempt to restrict the Chinese from developing sophisticated AI by not allowing them to have chips, and also trying to restrict them in the degree to which they can import and export the critical minerals that are needed to develop these products. So I think having this in the background, although it doesn't give us really concrete figures, is a really important start to thinking about how that supply chain might work. Kate Crawford and colleagues have done a really interesting anatomy of an AI system. If you wanted to visit that website, it's anatomy.of.ai, which you can kind of zoom in and out, right? It kind of shows you what one particular, I think it's an Amazon system, might look like. It's just a really cool scholar that's kind of at the intersections of like art and other things, and people love that kind of stuff. So. Okay, so now let's talk about what's actually going on in these systems and some of the field work that we did. So one of the first things that we wanted to kind of work out was, well, what kind of labor goes into this system? And so we created this kind of typology to think about the kind of end-to-end process, and then we started thinking about the different employment relationships through which this happens. So Kate correctly guessed that about 80% of the work is this kind of dark blue area, and that the actual model training is only about 20%. And of course, it then goes back and then kind of gets corrected and gets new data and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of the work is first collecting the data and then meticulously annotating it, right? For a computer vision algorithm to read something, it needs to be told what it's looking at, right? What does a tree look like? What does a child look like? Automated vehicles are one of the prime examples of this, because the auto industry has invested so much in this kind of software. And so some of the most sophisticated types of data annotation tasks that exist, something like LiDAR software, which I'll get to, helps cars essentially see their surroundings through bouncing lasers off things and measuring speed and distance and things like that. So we talk about the AI data pipeline, and we worked with an AI data company that is based in Silicon Valley, but has offices that it outsources all of its tedious work to in Kenya and Uganda, and they have about 4 different kind of factories there, really. And so we kind of worked alongside a lot of the workers there to kind of spell out what kind of tasks they did and to piece this together. And one of the things that we found really interesting about this is that it takes place in so many different environments. So you might have heard the phrase micro-working. There's a platform, for example, called Amazon Mechanical Turk. You can log in, you can do little tasks. Some of those are translation tasks, some of those are, I don't know, phrases. Some of them are data annotation tasks. So you'll get a little image and it'll ask you to like draw boxes around the fruit or vegetables, right? Maybe there's a supermarket that is going to scan all the refuse, and the computer needs to determine what is actually being thrown away. This can take place on digital platforms, in which case the workforce is remote. They can be mums at home doing something for 10 minutes. They can be people living in a refugee camp working off a mobile phone. They can be, you know, someone at the office doing it in their spare time. That's one particular model of how this kind of stuff works. Another one, though, is a kind of continuation of like outsourcing movement. So India was first and kind of largest player in this game in the 90s, where a lot of the kind of business processes were getting shifted offshore from the US. And a lot of the AI tasks actually follow this model. So they have basically like warehouses. I wonder if my next slide is that. Oh no, I've got this down. I'll get back to this. I'll get back to the warehouses. So this is the kind of task you might do, right? So you've got the bounding boxes there. Sometimes they'll ask you to like line the segments of the road so you can tell lines. Obviously, that's really important. This looks a little old. Often they need kind of point-to-point annotation now, because some of the software is growing more sophisticated. And so that's one of the reasons these tasks will continue to proliferate, right? Because once bounding boxes were good enough for all of these systems, but now they need tighter and more accurate frames. And you can imagine, like, when it's a life and death situation driving a vehicle, the accuracy levels of these have to be extraordinarily high. And so one of the facilities we visited had a kind of 95% minimum for most of their tasks, but for automated vehicle software was 99%, because the companies wouldn't accept, obviously, 1 or 2 pedestrians getting killed here and there. And so the actual places where this takes place are kind of like this, right? This is from here, Nairobi. And, you know, this is like the soul of AI is what like the slogan of the company. Never understood why they have that kind of unfinished third building, but there's like a guy with a shotgun that just kind of stands there at the gate with a little like string around there, and it's just a kind of digital sweatshop as far as the eye can see. And so this is called a business process outsourcing center, and it's another way in which much more accurate and much more specialized data annotation takes place. In addition to the micro working. So the field work we did, we were actually invited by this company. I'm not going to say their name just because there's a whole lot of drama associated with that, but I'm not going to say their name. Their headquarters is in San Francisco, based about 4,000 workers in various East African locations. We visited 3 of them. We did a bunch of interviews. This was just this year. Formally interviewed 46, but obviously there's lots of other chats going around. And thematic analysis, blah, blah, blah. So, and I should also say this is through an organization called Fair Work, which is based at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I work with a lot of colleagues there, and I want to acknowledge their labor because we have a great data for free labor kind of transfer good agreement that we do. I access the data, I work for them for free. Everyone is very happy by the end. And the work is fair. And so the Fair Work organization essentially rates a bunch of platforms. You might have heard about them kind of rating Deliveroo and Uber and stuff like that. They've moved into the AI game. And part of this was rating this company, basically. I do just want to acknowledge all, that I'm basically attached to them. So the International Division of Digital Labour, how does it work in this particular case study? So a lot of these companies, the modus operandi is to say that the reason for the outsourcing is an ethical one, that actually they're an ethical AI company doing the world a bunch of good by sourcing their workers through a notion of impact sourcing. It's a kind of broad tech for good kind of vibes. So you impact source someone when you specifically look into their demographic features and you determine that due to their education, the neighborhood in which they live, often for the slums of Kibera, one of the biggest slums of Nairobi, their chances of getting a job and their general employment status means that you would be doing them a favor. You'd be lifting them out of poverty if you were to employ them at your firm. It kind of was big in the early 2010s. Rockefeller Foundation was behind it for a while. World Bank was talking about it. This is also when micro-working, do digital work anywhere. This is going to save sub-Saharan Africa. And it's kind of been leveraged by a lot of contemporary AI companies as one of their USPs in the market, right? So come to us, get your data annotation tasks done with us, and you'll be part of the ethical AI supply chain because we are essentially lifting people poverty one person at a time. But the reality is obviously vastly different from this, and the kind of impact sourcing that a lot of these firms do in the BPO sector, the business process outsourcing, allows them to have this incredibly racialized division of labor between a kind of core team of managers that are often based in the US or Canada or wherever. This particular one, they were based kind of in Toronto and San Francisco. They then have the kind of machine learning or whatever data software people they need also based in these corporate offices. And these people kind of come from a background of like the US tech sector, business, some of them from NGOs, right? Because they do have a kind of NGO mission and a kind of vibe to them. But that's like the top level. There's like 10 or so people. They're all usually white or some non-white, but mostly white. They all obviously have permanent contracts. They're all getting paid tech wages, right? Because if you're not doing this, you're at Facebook, you're at Google, you need to pay kind of like not only 6-figure, but like 200,000-300,000. There's then a kind of second layer of people based at the outsourcing facilities themselves that you just kind of saw a picture of. People who are usually having backgrounds in the kind of Kenyan NGO sector. They usually have advanced degrees. Sometimes they've worked for software for banks or things like that. Sometimes they're kind of managerial people that have switched from one BPO company to another, but there's a kind of layer of East African leadership that kind of runs things on the ground. And this kind of the lower level of that will be like the project delivery managers who might manage like 100 or 150 workers and would have direct contact with the clients. Anyone who's client facing though is on this kind of like permanent contract. They're part of the leadership team. They're either the kind of local administrators or the kind of higher up people who have direct contact with investors or the Silicon Valley banks and things like that. And then the vast majority of workers are people who are impact sourced, right? So they're mostly coming from a slum. Some are educated, some are not, and they're doing data annotation tasks on temporary contracts, right? So most of the people that we interviewed and we talked with are on maybe a 1-month contract, a 3-month contract, right? It doesn't even go as long as the client's contract with them. It's used as a kind of performance management tool that after the end of the month, well, you know, you want to make sure you're not in the bottom 10% because that's not going to work out well for you. Because they're impact sourced as well, and this is the kind of political economy layer of the project, I think that'll work. Because they're impact sourced, the power discrepancy between the workers and the firm is immense, right? Because this is basically like extremely low paid work. People complain they don't have enough. But the alternative, if you've been impact sourced, is like selling food on the street or selling mobile phone something or others, or making juice or something, being in the market. Stuff that is incredibly risky and incredibly subject to, you know, COVID happening or not having enough of this, or, you know, you're earning like 1/5 of what you would earn with a kind of full-time contract. And so the workers here within this kind of system producing the kind of AI products that we all use are subject to this contract system and a concept of the bench. So if your contract ends and they don't need you anymore, and they do engage in these really significant ramp ups and ramp downs when they get and lose clients, you'll be put on the bench. That means you don't get paid anymore. In fact, it means you don't have a job. But they'll have your number, and they might have 1,000 people on the bench, no longer getting a paycheck, no longer able to support their family, that if they ever need them, it's good to know that they're there. And so people are just literally terrified of this benching system and going on the bench. What happens to all their friends they know who are on the bench? And it allows them to engage in a kind of labor discipline strategy involving 3 different metrics for speed, quality, and efficiency. And so your name and numbers are up on a big screen for everyone to see, and your name is either in green or it's in red based on how well you're faring on that particular day. If you don't meet your metrics for that day, you have to stay an hour later. If by the end of the week you haven't met your metrics for the week, you come in on Saturday to do an unpaid 4 or 5 hour shift. People are kind of working from about 7:40 a.m. to 6 p.m. And every second of their time is logged through a digital surveillance system, right? They've got like a screen monitoring system as well. They've got one 20-minute break and one 40-minute break for lunch. And yeah, the whole workforce is kind of, you know, they've got this huge warehouse in like what's a business park, and they're kind of scaling up and down as need be. Now, obviously, this is kind of problematic from the perspective of people who want to see job security, you know, decent work, fair work, that whole thing. Remuneration is also very questionable at this firm, because one of the parts of being an ethical AI supplier is that they're claimed to pay the living wage. And they actually do their own benchmarking to kind of find out where this is. But when we talk to the workers and we looked at pay slips, a lot of people were getting paid below the living wage that was being claimed. So at the same time, it was, you know, a kind of decent set. People were obviously very keen to maintain what they had. They didn't want to lose it. There weren't many other options available. This is the kind of one of the local markets in Gulu in northern Uganda, which is one of the centres that we visited. And if you're not in the centre and you're not working for the government or one of the Western NGOs or maybe one of the banks, you might be selling vegetables or doing something else, maybe running one of the local shops. and it's really, really tough work, and it's very precarious as well. So people are both desperate for the work, but also very critical of the way in which they're treated. And so with this job quality and remuneration, and I guess one of the other, shocking things that we found was, perhaps unsurprisingly, in an environment in which certain managers do have just an incredible degree of arbitrary power over others and a kind of traditional patriarchal society, a lot of gender-based discrimination and harassment happened. So some of the female workers we talked about just how widespread it was, that bosses would have like 3 or 4 girlfriends. With the younger recruits, people were being told that they wouldn't get a job unless they would be someone's girlfriend. It was like a surefire ticket to stay at the company if you were attached to one of the male managers. And there was also a lot of talk about people being fired just before their maternity leave. So kind of strategic firings of people. And of course, because it's a contract system, you can't really complain you got fired, you just didn't get your contract renewed. And because your contract is like being renewed every month or every 3 months, there's not much you can really do about it. So kind of, it was a kind of crazy and shocking experience to see the level of kind of inequality and the level of unchecked power that was happening in these kinds of situations. And so it kind of allowed us to think about this broader process and about who benefits and what's going on. And so one of the papers that we're doing is talking about the impact of impact sourcing, or the kind of ethics of impact sourcing, really trying to think about the broader value chains that are involved and who benefits from it. And I think one of the things that we really saw firsthand was that, the kind of top line is that it's reducing poverty, right? That it's a gift to these people. But really, the question of who benefits is, well, the AI companies do, right? Because they get access to an incredibly cheap and very well-disciplined workforce, right? There's no better way to have someone work harder than to have their other option to be returning to the slums where you employed them from. And the AI companies don't only gain economically through access to this workforce, it's also constantly something they harp on about, right? They tell investors about how ethical they are. They tell high-level workers from the US to attract talent, right? That they're a very ethical company. It's like working in an NGO with a tech sector salary. And it also allows companies to gain access to a particular type of venture capital. There are VC firms that essentially only invest in social impact projects. And so suddenly you're, in the mix for all these things as well. And so what we really saw at the base of this was an enormous transfer of value from the bottom chain of the pyramid, these 4,000 or so workers that were in many ways just highly disciplined into creating value for the company, that essentially went straight to the top to pay both for the managerial position salary, but mostly to then go back to the investors, right? Because this company had like a Series B, $20 million, $50 million investment. And, these people, as we all know, it's VC money. They're looking to receive 3 to 5 times what they're putting in 5 years later. So, that's millions and millions of dollars that need to go back to these companies. And I'll tell you exactly where it's coming from. It's coming from these 10-hour shifts that these workers are putting in. And so that's the title of one of our papers, The Poverty of Ethical AI. And so I think what we really saw, in addition to this kind of transfer of value, is that a company that is a social impact firm that purports to have a kind of double bottom line of both making profits for investors, but also pursuing a social mission, constantly faces this tension, as this company did, as we saw kind of within this case study, that the forces that are encouraging you as a director of this company to increase the profits and to reduce your margins are slowly going to erode the social impact that your company can do, because it's just not as valuable as the kind of profits that you can create. And furthermore, it's easier to fake the social impact. because you can have the glossy brochure saying you're doing this and you're doing that, and they're getting well-being services. You attend the well-being services and it's just a complete joke, right? So you can do so much with advertising while deep down, the actual structure of the business model, how your management structure runs, the orders that are coming from top down will inevitably erode the social impact of the business because of competitive market pressures that you face to lower your margins to compete with your competitors in the sector. Because the BPO sector, I mean, like many sectors in society, is really competitive. You have really slim margins, and you're competing with the Philippines, you're competing with Kenya, with India. You know, people are really trying to lower the price that they can charge their clients for this. And, you know, people care, I mean, big tech companies care about bad publicity, but not so much that they're going to really look too hard at this kind of stuff, right? And so we thought about, well, what can be done about this, right? So what kind of policy or actions or things. And I want to point to maybe 3 or 4 things. The first is collective action. And we've actually seen Kenyan content moderators recently form a content moderators union a few months ago. This was like right when we were doing our field work. There was a big kind of protest outside the office, and we were talking to some of the activists. And, you know, this is a really promising development, right? Because collective action in a contract-based system is extremely hard to do. But there are obviously very, you know, strong limitations to this. One of them is that if the work is not going to these kinds of places, it can be put on the digital platforms where people are literally geographically separated. So one of the advantages of having them together for the companies is tighter discipline, better, you know, better accuracy and efficiency. But the negative is obviously then labor unrest. But, you know, you can switch out, throw it somewhere else again. You might have a little bit, it might cost you a bit more, might be a bit less accurate, but, you know, you'd also completely destroy the strike, right? Because you don't have workers at a factory that must work that factory. The digital contracts just go somewhere else. So there are limitations of how effective that will be just because of how mobile the work and capital is. So collective organisation is one possibility, but it does face barriers that certain other forms of strike activity don't. Supply chain acts. One came in Germany a year ago. There's been one in France since 2017. In practice, both have been not very effective. I think because they're not well known, the unions are not encouraged to kind of use them. But theoretically, we can think about client-side regulation that would force certain companies to verify human rights abuses and minimum conditions throughout their supply chain. In Germany, one of the problems is that it's for companies with a minimum of 500 people. And just straight off the bat, OpenAI doesn't have 500 people, so they'd never be subject to this. They're also not in Germany, so they're doubly not subjected to it. But it's one interesting idea, right? Policies that are implemented on the supply side of the chain to think about what's going on throughout it. I think consumer pressure and boycotts, I don't think consumer boycotts have ever really worked in the tech sector. There have been a lot of like Facebook boycotts, even advertiser boycotts have not worked very well. But I think the strongest lever that people have in reality, just taking a realistic look at the kind of how power is organized at the moment, is probably naming and shaming of big names, and because they do care about that kind of thing. So rather than worker organizing, kind of consumer organizing, or both in tandem. But I don't have any real answers here. I'm just kind of throwing out possibilities. And based on conversations that I've had with people. But these are some of the kind of issues that are going on here. Oh, I have a whole, okay, I'm going to do this very quick. I didn't realize I had this whole other thing. So in addition to the kind of 5 minutes to do this, yeah, I'll do in 5 minutes. And then I know this is probably the more interesting to philosophers, but I'm not a philosopher. I already told you that. So it is still interesting to me as well. I'll do it quickly. So in addition to the inputs and the process through which AI data annotation is constructed, I also think there's a really strong colonial element to the knowledge production, so the outputs. And I think this is both text and image because, yeah, we'll get to it. So really this critical lens of modernity, coloniality school really helps us to question the kind of purported neutrality and universality of Western knowledge claims as insofar as they are created through AI outputs. And this is a kind of bread and butter of what they do, right? There's a huge epistemic dimension to a lot of their thought. And so when we're thinking about that, we can think about it at two specific points in the AI value chain. One is in the type of data sets and how they're constructed and gathered. The second is in the outputs that the algorithms are producing. And so just off the bat, there's been a lot of research on this already. Even to think about AI in the public imagination, Cave and Dehal from Oxford maybe, talk about to imagine an intelligent, autonomous, a gentle, powerful machine is to imagine a white machine, because the white racial frame ascribes these attributes predominantly to white people. So not even getting into the kind of details of this, we can have a kind of critical lens that helps us to see the kinds of cultural frames that we would use when we think about advanced technology and the kinds of reference points and associations that it would have in how companies advertise it, in how the media presents it to us. But let's turn back to the kind of data sets, right? Because, these things don't just come from thin air. The politics of data set construction is very important. These have often been scraped from very particular sources. The images have been gathered in particular ways. It gives us certain types of biases and prejudices that are essentially encoded into the data, right? Because of course, if we live in a society in which certain social hierarchies are present, the data that society produces is inevitably going to contain some of these. It's not just a kind of neutral objective knowledge. So I hope this is kind of hopefully coming as kind of common sense. So Timnit Gebru, the kind of famous Googler who was fired after writing a controversial paper about stochastic parrots, among other things, did one of the first and most highly cited studies where they found that commercial facial recognition algorithms were much more able to recognize the kind of light-skinned males than darker-skinned females. And this is kind of the start of that AI bias discussion of how are these outputs actually functioning in practice. And obviously, this is a result of the types of data sets that are included and overabundance of a certain type of person and less instances of other types in the data. In the image library of Lion 400M, which I think is 430 million image text pairs, right? So it allows the computer to kind of associate a particular text with an image, found that when an ML software used this data set, it produced hypersexualized images of Asian and Black women. And so when we think about these data sources, we need to think about where they're coming from. Does anyone remember where ChatGPT-3 got most of its data from? Where did they, just as a vibe?
Reddit?
Yeah, Reddit was one of the big ones. Have you heard of Common Crawl? So for 8 years, so this was 60% of ChatGPT's data, was an 8-year web search where websites were essentially just archived and stored in a kind of notation format. And it's basically the internet, as I would describe. 60% is basically the internet. Another 20 or 30% is every Reddit comment with more than 3 upvotes. And then they've basically stolen a bunch of book libraries and they've read all of the English Wikipedia. And that's basically it. That's ChatGPT-3. Obviously, they've gotten cluey to the fact that people don't really like that. And so they don't tell us where some of the additional training that ChatGPT-4 and others are getting. So unlike the first one, they don't tell us. But of course, if anyone has read the comment section on anything, you'll know that it skews young white male American and often has overtly racist, sexist, ageist perspectives overrepresented in the data. The ChatGPT data set is no different, despite the safety guardrails that engineers tried to put into it, you can trick it into basically telling you what its data is in various ways. I'm sure you all saw on Twitter when it came out. And same with some of the image libraries. This is a huge problem, right? Because this is going to be increasingly a source of knowledge for people, and the kind of outputs that it's producing, perhaps not people in this room, but many people take them to be kind of objective truths about the world, that despite some minor hallucinations here or there, that will get increasingly accurate and kind of giving you true sources of knowledge that you can rely on. I'm going to skip Ruha. Sorry, Ruha. And so some of this is going to appear in these articles, which are in various stages of, I just want to put this out there to rep my collab people, but also to say that some of it will come out in a new book called Humans of AI, The Hidden Labor Behind Artificial Intelligence, that I just sold today. So good on me. So yeah, my apologies that I wasn't able to do the last bit in more detail, but I'd be really interested to hear how this intersects with your own work, and yeah, what kind of interesting philosophizing one can do on the basis of some of this unpacking of the black box of AI. So thank you very much for coming.